Thank you for joining us today. My name is Colleen Cogill, and I'm a legal fellow with UNHCR. During my 2-year fellowship project with UNHCR, I am working on a project aimed at enhancing the quality of legal representation in the United States by ensuring that lawyers and adjudicators are aware of UNHCR's position and how to use it to leverage asylum claims. Today is the first webinar in a series of trainings we hope to conduct. This webinar will provide a general overview and lay the framework for future webinars, which will dive more deeply into specific topics. In today's webinar, I hope to cover the following topics: a brief 5-minute overview of UNHCR, who we are and what we do, an introduction to international law, an overview of the role of international law in U.S. asylum adjudications. This webinar is aimed at explaining how attorneys in the U.S. can use international law and UNHCR guidance to leverage asylum claims. Starting with the first topic, UNHCR is the UN Refugee Agency. It was created by the UN General Assembly in 1950 with the responsibility to provide international protection to refugees and others of concern. UNHCR's authority stems from the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol. These instruments obligate state parties to cooperate with UNHCR in the exercise of its mandate and to facilitate its supervisory role. The core of both the Convention and the protocol is the principle of non-refoulement. This principle obligates states not to return or expel a refugee to a place where he or she faces persecution or a real risk of serious harm. So as I mentioned on the last slide, UNHCR's primary purpose is to safeguard the rights and well-being of individuals who have been forced to flee. UNHCR achieves this goal by providing international protection and assistance to refugees and seeking permanent, durable solutions for refugees. These actions can take a variety of forms depending on the country and the context. In addition to providing protection and assistance to refugees, the UN General Assembly has recognized UNHCR as the UN organization with the international protection mandate for stateless persons. Currently, UNHCR cares for over 63 million people affected by forced displacement in 125 different countries. Under its mandate, UNHCR provides protection to refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, internally displaced persons, returnees, and others of concern. Others of concern refers to specific groups of persons not normally falling under UNHCR's mandate, but to whom UNHCR extends protection and assistance pursuant to a special request by a body of the United Nations. The 1951 Convention defines a refugee as any person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or, owing to such a fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, is unable, or, owing to such a fear, is unwilling to return to it. This definition parallels the U.S. definition found in the 1980 Refugee Act, with only minor changes in wording. We'll discuss this in more detail in just a moment. Our office here in D.C. is the regional office for the United States and the Caribbean. We have 3 protection units: U.S. Protection, Caribbean Protection, and Resettlement. For purposes of this webinar, I'm going to focus on the work of the U.S. Protection Unit. Broadly speaking, the overall goal of the U.S. Protection Unit is to safeguard the rights of individuals seeking asylum in the United States. Our main focus areas are ensuring access to territory, protecting access to asylum, advocating for use of detention as a measure of last resort, and preventing and reducing statelessness. UNHCR and the U.S. have been working in partnership to protect refugees for decades. UNHCR works with the U.S. to provide technical guidance on issues of concern, monitoring, and operational support. I've included pictures of 2 recent reports produced by the U.S. Protection Unit here: Children on the Run and Women on the Run. Both of these reports look at reasons why women and children are fleeing El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico in search of protection in the U.S. and obstacles they encounter in finding protection. With that background of UNHCR, I now want to shift the focus to international law and its relevance in the U.S. context. I want to quickly go over what constitutes international law. This slide shows 3 different sources of international law. The term international law encompasses treaties, conventions, covenants, and protocols to treaties. These are all binding agreements between 2 or more countries. The Refugee Convention and the Protocol are examples of such binding instruments. When a country accedes to the convention, it is bound to comply with its provisions. The second form of international law here is declarations and resolutions. These are non-binding instruments that contain statements of principles or concerns that reflect the considered views of nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an example of a non-binding instrument that sets forth certain rights all individuals are entitled to. International law also encompasses a body of law known as customary law. Customary law refers to practices or principles that are so broadly accepted that nations acknowledge the practice or principle as binding even without a treaty. For example, the principle of non-refoulement is considered customary international law. Non-refoulement is the principle that a state must not return or expel a refugee to a place where his or her life or freedom would be threatened. Because it is considered customary international law, this principle is binding on states even if they have not signed the convention or the protocol. This slide shows different areas of international law that are brought to bear in protecting refugees. When we talk about international law, we're referring to a broad body of rules that apply within and between countries. But within international law, there are several subtopics or bodies of law. For example, humanitarian law is a subset of international law that covers the law of armed conflict. Human rights law is another subset of international law and encompasses several treaties, conventions, and covenants that define or declare basic rights and freedoms that all individuals are entitled to. Human rights law includes the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Each of these bodies of law may overlap with a claim for refugee protection. A claim for refugee protection may be based on harm an individual has suffered or faces as a result of war or civil strife. This would implicate humanitarian law. A claim for refugee protection could also be based on a violation of fundamental human rights. International refugee law is another subset of international law. The primary sources of international refugee law are the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 Protocol. The 1951 Convention originated after World War II and was originally limited to protecting European refugees. The 1967 Protocol incorporated the substantive provisions of the Convention, but removed the geographical and temporal limitations of the 1951 Convention, therefore universalizing the refugee definition. The Convention and the Protocol address who is a refugee, his or her rights and responsibilities, and the legal obligations of states. The core of both the Convention and the Protocol is the principle of non-refoulement, which again prohibits states from expelling or returning a refugee to a country where his or her life or freedom is at risk. To protect against refoulement, states must provide effective protection to refugees and should ensure all asylum seekers have access to fair and efficient asylum procedures. As I mentioned earlier, UNHCR serves as the guardian of the Convention and the Protocol, meaning that states are expected to cooperate with UNHCR in ensuring that the rights of refugees are respected and protected. Since its inception in 1950, UNHCR has issued considerable guidance to clarify the obligations of states under the Convention and the Protocol and to assist with meaningful implementation of these instruments. This slide lists 3 forms of UNHCR guidance: the UNHCR Handbook on Procedures and Criteria for Determining Refugee Status, UNHCR's Guidelines on International Protection, and UNHCR's Eligibility Guidelines. The UNHCR Handbook is internationally recognized as an important source of interpretation for international refugee law. The handbook breaks down and explains the various components of the refugee definition. UNHCR's Guidelines on International Protection accompany and expand on the guidance issued in the handbook. The guidelines offer substantive and procedural guidance on specific issues that arise in determining refugee status, such as how to interpret the term membership in a particular social group. Finally, UNHCR's eligibility guidelines. UNHCR issues the eligibility guidelines to assist decision makers and private practitioners in assessing the international protection needs of asylum seekers. UNHCR's eligibility guidelines provide legal interpretations to promote accurate interpretation and application of the Convention, the Protocol, and relevant regional instruments. As is currently relevant in the U.S., UNHCR recently issued eligibility guidelines for El Salvador and Honduras. All of these resources can be found online and on our website. We are often asked how and why international law is relevant in U.S. courts. The U.S. acceded to the 1967 Protocol in 1968. As I mentioned, the 1967 Protocol binds parties to comply with the substantive provisions of the 1951 Convention. Therefore, by acceding to the 1967 Protocol, the U.S. is also bound by the Convention. By acceding to the Protocol, the U.S. has committed to comply with its provisions and provide effective protection to refugees. This forms the basis of the U.S.'s obligation to comply with international refugee law. In addition to acceding to the Protocol, the U.S. has also made clear its intention to comply with international refugee law. The 1980 Refugee Act was implemented with the express intent of bringing the U.S. into compliance with the Protocol, as recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Cardozo-Fonseca. In addition, under U.S. jurisprudence, U.S. courts have an obligation to construe U.S. statutes in a manner consistent with U.S. international obligations whenever possible. Therefore, the Refugee Act should be interpreted and implemented in a manner consistent with the Protocol and the Convention. To assist with proper interpretation and implementation of the Convention and the Protocol, UNHCR has created extensive guidance for states and adjudicators. Because the U.S. has undertaken to comply with the Convention and the Protocol, by acceding to the Protocol and implementing the Refugee Act, it should look to UNHCR's guidance to ensure proper implementation of these instruments. The UNHCR handbook and guidelines were expressly created for this purpose. They interpret and offer guidance on the obligations set forth in the Convention and the Protocol. The Supreme Court has recognized the importance of the UNHCR handbook and UNHCR guidelines, as shown on this slide with quotes from Nam v. Holder and Cardozo-Fonseca. In Nam v. Holder, the Supreme Court acknowledged that it has consistently turned to UNHCR for assistance in interpreting U.S. obligations under the Refugee Convention. And in Cardozo-Fonseca, the Court stated that the handbook provides significant guidance in interpreting the refugee definition. This is to show that courts are paying attention to what UNHCR has to say, and they look to UNHCR guidance when interpreting the refugee definition. Wrapping up this discussion of the role of international law in the U.S., this slide is meant to give an overview of the argument. Starting at the top, by acceding to the Protocol and through the Protocol of the 1951 Convention, the U.S. has an obligation to comply with the provisions in these instruments. To give meaning and help shape these obligations, UNHCR has issued the handbook, guidelines, and eligibility criteria to help guide states and adjudicators in interpreting the refugee definition. The handbook, guidelines, and eligibility criteria are all resources that can be cited in U.S. courts, and, as shown on the last slide, U.S. courts have relied on these interpretations in analyzing refugee claims and interpreting U.S. obligations under the Convention. I now want to talk about how to use international law and UNHCR guidance in asylum cases. These are two examples of how these resources can be used. U.S. courts have looked to UNHCR guidance to interpret specific legal questions, such as what constitutes persecution, or how to define and interpret the term membership in a particular social group. Courts have also looked to UNHCR reports in examining country conditions in the asylum seeker's country of origin. UNHCR reports are similar to those you might see from other organizations or agencies, such as Human Rights Watch or the Department of State. However, UNHCR's reports examine country conditions from a refugee protection perspective, and are therefore very relevant to asylum proceedings. UNHCR's reports can and should be submitted with an asylum claim to provide the adjudicator with background information and context about the human rights and refugee protection situation in the applicant's country of origin. For example, the UNHCR's report, Women on the Run, can be submitted with the claim from Central America to demonstrate the conditions women are fleeing in the Northern Triangle in Mexico. Focusing now on UNHCR's guidelines, I want to give a little more context as to how UNHCR guidelines might be relevant in your asylum case. I want to look specifically at a few different guidelines and what information can be found in these documents. UNHCR began issuing guidelines on international protection in 2002 to complement the interpretive guidance in the handbook. There are currently 9 different guidelines on international protection covering different topics. The guidelines all offer substantive and procedural instruction on interpretation of the refugee definition. Here, we're going to look at 4 different guidelines to get an idea of what information they provide. All of these resources can be found on our website as well as RefWorld. UNHCR's first guideline on international protection covers gender-related persecution. The gender guidelines offer substantive and procedural guidance on interpretation of the refugee definition from a gender perspective. The gender guidelines discuss how to conduct the well-founded fear analysis from a gender perspective, including gender-specific forms of persecution, such as female genital mutilation, domestic violence, and sexual violence. The gender guidelines also examine each of the convention grounds, race, nationality, religion, particular social group, and political opinion from a gender perspective, offering guidance on how gender and sex can constitute a particular social group, as well as how a woman's view of gender roles can constitute a political opinion. UNHCR issued guidelines on interpreting the term membership in a particular social group in 2002. The PSG guidelines analyze UNHCR's approach to defining what constitutes a particular social group. UNHCR's definition is much broader than the current U.S. jurisprudence. In most jurisdictions, U.S. courts require an individual to prove that the group is socially distinct and particular. In contrast, UNHCR believes it should be an alternative approach, requiring either a protected characteristic or a social distinction. U.S. decisions requiring both are thus in conflict with UNHCR's interpretation of the refugee definition, and the PSG guidelines can be used to support this view. The PSG guidelines also discuss how harm from non-state actors can be carried out on the basis of one or more of the grounds to refugee protection. In 2009, UNHCR issued the Guidelines on Child Asylum Claims in response to the growing number of children seeking refugee protection. The Guidelines on Child Asylum Claims offers substantive and procedural guidance on carrying out refugee status determinations in a child-sensitive manner. This includes analyzing and discussing child-specific forms of persecution and agents of persecution as relevant to the well-founded fear analysis. The Guidelines on Child Asylum Claims also discuss procedural safeguards that should be implemented in children's cases, such as evaluating the claim from a child's perspective, taking into account their age and vulnerability, and consideration of the best interests of the child. The Guidelines on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity are the most recently issued UNHCR guidelines on international protection. The Sexual Orientation Guidelines go through an analysis of the refugee definition from an LGBTI perspective. The guidelines give an overview of international law protecting equality and non-discrimination, which may be relevant to the well-founded fear analysis. The guidelines also discuss common forms of persecution in LGBTI claims, such as discrimination, physical violence or intimidation, restriction of certain human rights, and criminalization of same-sex relations. The Sexual Orientation Guidelines also examine each of the convention grounds and how each might be raised in an LGBTI asylum case, with a particular focus on interpreting membership in a particular social group. I've included a few case examples here showing how courts have relied on or cited UNHCR guidance. In Zhang v. Ashcroft, the Ninth Circuit used the UNHCR handbook to support the view that excessive discrimination can be considered persecution. In Mejia Romero v. Holder, the First Circuit relied on UNHCR's guidelines on child asylum claims in analyzing how children's claims should be evaluated. And in Escobar v. Holder, the Seventh Circuit cited to a UNHCR report on conditions in Colombia and assessing country conditions in the asylum seeker's country of origin. Again, the guidelines we just covered are only a selection of UNHCR resources. UNHCR also issues eligibility criteria that assess the international protection needs of asylum seekers from certain countries, reports, and other resources available on our website and on RefWorld. To help illustrate how UNHCR guidance can be used, I want to go through a brief case example. On this slide, I've put a brief description of the facts of a case. After reading the facts, we'll discuss what UNHCR guidance might be relevant. Felix is a citizen of Guatemala. In 2009, gang members killed his father outside of his father's church. Felix's cousin witnessed the murder and agreed to testify against the gang. However, she was killed the day before the hearing. Felix's sister has also received threats from gang members, even though she neither witnessed the attack nor agreed to testify against the gang. Felix argues that he fears persecution because of the gang's vendetta against his family. And these facts have been taken from a real case, which was Rios v. Lynch. As a refresher, these are the elements Felix must prove in order to meet the refugee definition. He must show that he is outside of his country of nationality or former habitual residence, that he fears persecution, that such persecution is well-founded, and that the persecution is on account of his race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And finally, that owing to such a fear, he does not wish to return to his country of nationality or former habitual residence. Thinking back on the facts, Felix is arguing that he is at risk of persecution because of his family ties to an individual who the gang perceived as a threat. The most logical ground is therefore membership in a particular social group, with the group being Felix's family. With that in mind, the following UNHCR guidance would be relevant in submitting a claim for asylum. First, UNHCR's guidelines on membership in a particular social group highlight that states have recognized families as a social group. In formulating a claim for asylum, attorneys can cite the guidelines as supporting the view that family is a recognized social group. Second, UNHCR's gang guidance note discusses family members as a group that may be routinely targeted by gangs. As relevant to our case example, the gang guidance note states that even though the applicant may not have personally opposed the gangs or does not share the views of his or her family members, the gang may attribute such resistance or views to the applicant. For example, a woman could be exposed to harm due to being perceived by gangs as holding the same anti-gang views as her father, husband, son, or brothers. In our case example, Felix feared persecution because the gang had targeted his cousin for her perceived opposition to the gang. The gang had also threatened his sister. The gang guidance note can be cited to support the fact that family members are, in fact, a social group that may be targeted by gangs. This could be used as evidence of surrounding circumstances to support the applicant's credibility or to support the well-founded fear analysis. Lastly, UNHCR's handbook explains that the well-founded fear analysis must take into account surrounding circumstances and country conditions. The handbook could be cited to explain why country conditions in Guatemala should be considered in addition to Felix's own account. Here, even though Felix did not personally receive threats from the gangs, he feared persecution based on what happened to his cousin and his sister. The UNHCR handbook can be used to support the notion that country conditions and evidence of what happens to relatives or friends is relevant to the well-founded fear analysis. So that concludes the topics that I wanted to discuss today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at Cogill, COWGILL, @unhcr.org. And please remember that we are going to be holding future webinars on the following topics: children's claims, women's claims, LGBTI claims, and claims from Central America. Information about when these will be held can be found on our website with the link provided below. Thank you.